The weeks before the cruise returned to me later, with a cruelty that memory saves for the things we refuse to understand in time. Sarah had been visiting more often than usual. At first, I welcomed it with the embarrassing gratitude of an old father, trying not to show how much he misses being needed. She came by on Tuesdays with takeout she did not eat, sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone, and asked questions that wore the clothing of concern. Had I been sleeping well? Had I considered hiring someone to manage the house? Did I ever feel overwhelmed by paperwork? Did I still keep the safe combination in the same place? She would smile after questions like that, light and teasing, as if the question were evidence of intimacy rather than inspection. Glenn would arrive later, always with some reason he could not stay long, and he would stand in doorways instead of entering rooms fully, letting his eyes move over shelves, file cabinets, mail stacked on the counter, the calendar near the refrigerator where I wrote appointments in block letters because Margaret used to say my handwriting looked like a blueprint drawn during an earthquake. I remember one evening when Sarah asked for the Wi-Fi password, even though her phone had connected automatically for years. I gave it to her without thinking. Glenn laughed and said, "You are too trusting, Gerald. You know that, right?" I had laughed too. It is strange, the things people tell you plainly before you are willing to hear them. There had been a Sunday dinner in my house 10 days before Sarah suggested the cruise. I cooked chicken the way Margaret used to, with lemon and rosemary tucked under the skin, and Sarah complimented it 3 times, which should have told me something was wrong because my daughter liked food but rarely noticed effort unless she wanted to soften the ground beneath a request. Glenn brought wine that cost more than he could comfortably afford, or more accurately, more than he could afford with his own money, and he made a show of opening it carefully, breathing it, praising its structure like a man performing wealth for invisible judges. The conversation drifted toward retirement, as it had been doing more and more often. "You know, Dad," Sarah said, pushing a carrot around her plate, "you do not have to keep proving anything. The business runs. Marcus handles so much already. Maybe it is time to enjoy what you built." Glenn placed his glass down and added, "It is not about giving up control. It is about legacy planning. You always say good builders think ahead." I remember feeling a little proud that he had quoted something I said years earlier. That pride blinded me. He continued, "A strong plan protects everyone. It protects Sarah if something happens. It protects the company if you have a health event. It protects you from being taken advantage of." The irony sat there at my table wearing a clean shirt, and I passed him the potatoes. Another time, Sarah found one of Margaret's old scarves in the hall closet and held it against her face for so long that I had to look away. She cried quietly, and I went to her because grief still made me helpless. I put my arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into me, small again for one dangerous second. "I miss her," she whispered. "I do too," I said. She wiped her cheeks and told me she worried about losing me too, that the idea of being alone in the world terrified her. It was such a perfect truth that it hid the lie beside it. She did miss her mother. She did fear losing me. She also needed access, signatures, passwords, and the financial structure of a life she had begun to measure in advance. That is how manipulation survives inside families. It does not always replace real feeling. Sometimes it grows beside it, feeding from the same roots until the victim cannot tell which branch is alive and which one is strangling the tree. On the day she pitched the cruise, she did it with photographs. She brought her tablet to the house and set it in front of me after dinner, swiping through images of blue water, white balconies, glossy dining rooms, sunset decks full of smiling people who did not know they were advertising a murder site. 7 days, she said, no work, no calls. Just us. Glenn found an incredible discount through a client. I asked whether they could afford it, and she rolled her eyes with theatrical affection. Dad, please, let someone else treat you for once. Glenn was watching me when she said that, and now I know he was watching the word treat land. He wanted me relaxed. He wanted me flattered. He wanted me to believe the trip was generosity, flowing toward me instead of a corridor being built around me. I said yes because I wanted to see my daughter happy. That sentence has excused more disasters than pride ever has. The first day on the ship had felt almost healing. That is the part I rarely admit because it makes me feel foolish. Sarah held my arm during embarkation and laughed when I misread the deck numbers. Glenn took photographs of us near the railing and insisted I stand in the middle, one arm around each of them, the 3 of us framed by open sea. He gave my shoulder a little squeeze at the moment the camera clicked. Later in the cabin, I looked at the photo and thought I looked tired but content. Sarah looked beautiful. Glenn looked like a man who had already found the angle. At lunch he asked about Margaret, and I told a story about the first time she saw the ocean. Sarah smiled with tears in her eyes. Glenn listened attentively, but his questions kept steering toward logistics. Did Margaret have a separate estate? Had I updated things after she passed? Was the foundation already in the will, or just something I donated to while alive? He did it so gently that even now I cannot decide whether he was clumsy or talented. Maybe both. A skilled liar does not need to avoid suspicious questions if he can make them sound caring. That first night there was dancing in the atrium. Sarah made me dance with her to an old song Margaret loved, and for 3 minutes I allowed myself to forget Glenn was watching from a table with his phone in his hand. Sarah rested her head against my shoulder the way she had at 16 when a boy broke her heart, and I smelled her perfume, the same floral brand she had worn for years. She said, "I want us to be close again, Dad. I know I have been distant." I squeezed her hand and said, "Distance happens. We can close it." She pulled back and looked at me with wet eyes. "Promise." I promised. Behind her, Glenn lifted his phone and took another picture. Later, I would wonder whether the pictures were from memory or evidence. Happy family, loving daughter, aging father, a clean story in advance. By the second day, the microcontrol had become visible only in hindsight. Glenn ordered for Sarah at dinner before she finished looking at the menu. She smiled and told the waiter what he said is fine, but her finger stayed on the seafood dish she had been reading. He corrected her posture in photographs with little touches at her lower back. He answered questions directed at her. When I asked whether she was still enjoying her consulting work, Glenn said, "She is taking a break from that environment. Toxic people, bad for her stress." Sarah's smile tightened, and she said, "It is not really a break." But Glenn had already started telling a story about a client who undervalued her. I did not press. I thought I was respecting a marriage. I was actually watching one person edit another in real time. There was a moment at the pool that should have stopped me. Sarah dropped her sunglasses, and before she could bend for them, Glenn said, "Careful, sweetheart. You are always clumsy near edges." He laughed when he said it. Sarah laughed too, a half-second late. Edges, clumsy, fall. The vocabulary was already being rehearsed. I remember looking at the pool water, turquoise and harmless, and feeling a brief chill that I blamed on shade. Glenn caught me looking and said, "Gerald, you okay?" I said I was fine. He smiled. "Good. We need you around a little longer." He gave the sentence the rhythm of a joke. It landed like one at the time. Memory changes pitch after betrayal. It replays the line with the music removed. During a family cruise, my son-in-law pushed me into the sea and shouted that it was time for me to learn how to swim with sharks. The words did not arrive as a joke. They did not come wrapped in panic or surprise, or the clumsy shock of an accident. They came sharp and low beneath the louder performance he gave for everyone else, beneath his fake scream for help, beneath the wind dragging at the deck lights and the black water opening under me like a mouth. One second I was standing beside the railing with my hand resting on polished steel, listening to Glenn talk about the future, as if the future were a contract he had already signed, and the next his palms were between my shoulder blades with the full force of a grown man behind them. The railing hit my thighs, the night sky spun, and for a fraction of a second before gravity took me, I saw his face without the mask. No smile, no panic, no son-in-law warmth, just calculation, flat and hungry, and a disappointment already forming because even as he pushed me, he understood that murder has to be both violent and tidy, and the ocean was supposed to do the cleaning for him. Then I was falling, hearing his voice tear open into a theatrical shout for the passengers who might be close enough to hear. "Help! Man overboard! Gerald fell! Someone help him!" And underneath that, almost intimate, almost pleased, the sentence he meant only for me. "Time to learn how to swim with sharks, old man." The water struck me with such force that I did not feel wet at first. I felt broken. The Atlantic at night is not blue. It is not romantic. It is not the postcard ocean people admire from balconies while holding champagne. It is black weight and salt and cold pressure. It closed around me like a fist. My lungs seized before I could inhale. Then my body betrayed me and tried to breathe anyway, dragging brine down my throat in a burning rush. My blazer ballooned, my shoes pulled at my feet, and for a moment I sank with my arms out as if the sea had been expecting me. Above me, the cruise ship slid forward in a palace of lights, impossibly tall, impossibly indifferent, and I understood with terrible clarity that a life can be reduced to distance. 10 feet from the railing I was a father, a widower, a contractor, a man with accounts and keys, and a daughter who still called him dad when she wanted something. 20 feet below the surface I was weight in a dark element, a problem already solving itself. I kicked once, my niece screamed. I kicked again. The surface wavered above me, not close enough, and I thought of Margaret, not as she had looked in the hospital at the end, thin and pale and brave beyond anything I deserved, but as she had looked the morning Sarah was born, exhausted and laughing, her hair damp at her temples while she told me not to hold the baby like a sack of cement. I saw Sarah's tiny hand around my finger. I saw the yellow construction helmet I bought her when she was 5 because she wanted to visit my job site and be the boss. I saw Glenn on their wedding day, smiling that bright, confident smile, while he promised to take care of my little girl. Then I surfaced with a torn sound that was half breath and half animal. The ship was farther than it should have been. Lights moved along the railings. People were shouting. An alarm began somewhere high above, rising and falling with mechanical urgency. The ocean slapped my face, filled my mouth, turned every breath into labor. I tried to get my shoes off and managed one, then lost the other because my fingers were stiffening, and the waves kept lifting me only to let me drop again. I could hear my name, Sarah's voice, I thought, or maybe I invented it because a father will reach for his child's voice, even when that child has just become a question he cannot survive asking. I rolled onto my back the way I had learned as a boy in a community pool that smelled of chlorine and hot concrete. Float, breathe, do not fight the water with anger. But the ocean did not care about boyhood lessons. It pushed into my ears and slapped under my chin and dragged heat out of my bones. I looked toward the ship and searched the railing. I found Glenn. Even from the water, even through darkness and motion, I knew the shape of him. He was standing with one hand pressed to his head, the other pointing toward me, playing grief, playing shock, playing the devoted son-in-law whose father by marriage had simply slipped. He did not climb over after me. He did not throw himself into the water. He did not even remove his shoes. He stayed dry. The rescue took 27 minutes. I know because later, after they wrapped me in heated blankets and recorded my temperature and asked questions in soft, careful voices, Dr. Martinez told me the time between the alarm and the recovery. 27 minutes is a short number on a report. It is not short in the ocean. It is long enough to make prayers turn into bargaining and bargaining turn into silence. It is long enough for your mind to stop thinking in sentences and begin thinking in fragments. Air, light, daughter, hands, why? It is long enough to understand that death is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is repetitive, one wave after another, one failed breath after another, one muscle surrendering before the next. By the time the rescue boat reached me, my hands could not close around the flotation ring. A crewman had to hook his arm under mine and shout at me to stay with him, as if staying were a decision I still had full control over. They hauled me up like damaged cargo. I remember retching seawater onto the floor. I remember a young crew member saying, "He is breathing," and another saying, "Get blankets now." I remember Sarah's scream from somewhere above, not a clean scream of love but a broken, complicated sound that I did not know how to read. And then I saw Glenn again, kneeling beside her, his face wet with tears he had produced from somewhere, his shirt spotless, his hair only disturbed by wind. "Thank God, Gerald," he said when they brought me aboard. "Thank God you're alive. I thought we lost you." I looked at him from under a silver emergency blanket, while my teeth hammered together so violently that speech seemed impossible. And what I saw in his eyes was not relief. Relief opens a person. It softens them, makes them foolish and grateful and temporarily unguarded. Glenn's eyes tightened. They flickered once toward the crew, once toward Sarah, once toward the doctor, measuring witnesses, measuring risk, measuring how much a half-drowned man might remember. The disappointment was small, but it was there. He had planned a funeral and received a complication. That was the first clean fact I took with me into the medical bay. They put me in a narrow bed that smelled of antiseptic and warmed plastic. Dr. Martinez was kind in the practical way of people who know kindness must have tasks attached to it. She checked my pupils, listened to my lungs, wrapped warmed blankets around my legs, and told me I was lucky. Lucky. I almost laughed, but my throat hurt too much. Sarah hovered on my left side with both hands around mine, crying in waves that began whenever a crew member entered and faded, whenever she thought no one was watching. Glenn stood behind her with one palm on her shoulder, the pose of a man supporting his wife through trauma. His fingers rested lightly at the base of her neck, and I noticed something then that I had missed for years. Sarah did not lean into his touch. She held still under it. That stillness did not mean innocence. It did not mean guilt either. It meant she had learned to wait for Glenn's pressure before deciding what shape to take. "Dad," Sarah whispered, bending close enough that her hair brushed the blanket. "I was so scared. When Glenn ran back and shouted that you had fallen, I thought my heart stopped. I thought I lost you." Her voice cracked. It was a good crack, convincing, almost real. Maybe part of it was real. Human beings are rarely pure in the way stories want them to be. A daughter can help plan a betrayal and still be frightened when the water refuses to give her father back neatly. A man can try to murder someone and still tremble when the murder fails. That is the horror of family. The emotions do not disappear just because the loyalty does. Glenn leaned closer after the doctor stepped to the counter to prepare something. His cologne reached me before his words, expensive and sharp. The same scent he had worn at my daughter's wedding. The same scent that had clung faintly to my dining room after every dinner, where he praised my generosity with one hand and calculated my assets with the other. "It happened so fast, Gerald," he said softly. "One second you were admiring the view, and then you were gone. The railing must have been wet. You leaned too far. It was a terrible accident." He studied my face while he said accident, placing the word between us like a brick in a wall he needed me to help build. Sarah was wiping her eyes. Dr. Martinez was reading my chart. Nobody was looking directly at us. I pulled breath through a throat lined with salt and pain, and I used what little strength I had left to give him 3 words. "I know everything." The change in him was worth the pain it took to speak. He jerked back so quickly that Sarah looked up startled, but he recovered before she could read it. His mouth closed. His hands dropped to his sides. For one second his face was white and naked, the fear not of a man accused, but of a man whose private room has been entered. Then the mask came back, not perfectly but fast enough to fool anyone who wanted to be fooled. "What did you say, Gerald?" he asked too loudly, and Dr. Martinez turned from the counter. I let my eyes close and allowed my body to shiver. "Nothing," I rasped. "Just cold." The next morning they released me from the medical bay with instructions to rest, hydrate, and avoid exposed decks at night. Dr. Martinez smiled when she said that last part, and I nodded like a man who had merely learned caution from a slip. Glenn and Sarah were waiting outside in matching white polo shirts, a detail that struck me as obscene. They looked like a family from a brochure. They had coordinated their clothing while I was coughing salt out of my lungs. Sarah linked her arm through mine, her fingers cold against my sleeve. "Breakfast first, Dad. You need something warm." Glenn found a quiet table at the buffet. Glenn smiled, and I noticed for the first time how much of his charm depended on other people being willing to complete the illusion for him. He offered his arm. He called me buddy. He asked whether I felt steady enough to walk. Every gesture had an audience attached. At the buffet, the ship had returned to its cheerful business of consumption. Passengers piled fruit onto plates, complained about omelette stations, laughed over coffee, and moved around us with the innocent selfishness of vacationers. Nothing in the room suggested that the night before I had hung between life and death, while the man now buttering toast across from me measured whether I would still be useful dead. Sarah fussed over my cup, my napkin, my chair, asking too many questions in too bright a voice. "Do you want oatmeal, Dad? Should I get more hot water? Are you sure that chair is comfortable?" Glenn watched me between bites, calm now, because he believed the shock had confused me. He asked it gently after a few minutes, the way a concerned relative might ask about a lost wallet. "Do you remember much of the fall?" I looked down at my toast, butter pooling into the rough surface, and made the second most important decision of my life. The first had been marrying Margaret. The second was becoming smaller than I was. Not because I wanted to disappear forever, not yet, but because predators lean closer when they believe prey is wounded. "It is all fuzzy," I said, letting embarrassment enter my voice. "I remember the stars. I remember feeling dizzy. Maybe the railing was wet like you said. After that, just water." I lifted my hand slightly and let it tremble. Some of the tremble was real. Enough of it was performance. Sarah squeezed my wrist, her face flooding with relief so quickly that my stomach turned. Glenn's shoulders loosened by a fraction of an inch. He hid it by reaching for his coffee, but I saw it. I had spent 40 years reading subcontractors who were lying about timelines and clients who were pretending budgets, did not matter. Glenn was not as subtle as he believed. Good, Sarah said, then caught herself. I mean not good. I just mean you do not need to force yourself to remember. The important thing is you are safe. Her eyes flicked toward Glenn before returning to me. There it was again, the tiny permission-seeking movement, the silent checking of weather in the room. I had raised this woman, and I suddenly realized I had not watched her in years. I had looked at her, spoken to her, paid for things, answered calls, attended dinners, but I had not truly watched. Grief had made me generous and lazy. Loneliness had made me eager to accept any version of family that entered my house and used the word love. Sarah had been changing in front of me, and I had mistaken proximity for knowledge. The first pressure cycle after the fall began almost politely. Glenn suggested a helicopter excursion in St. Thomas. He said the views would be spectacular, that after staring death in the face, I deserved to see the islands from above, and he smiled as if placing me in a small aircraft over open water were the most natural idea in the world. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Not long, just long enough. Glenn noticed. His jaw tightened. I noticed both. Dad probably needs something calmer, she said. Maybe just the spa or a show. Glenn's smile remained, but the temperature behind it dropped. Of course, rest is important. We can decide later. Later became the word that followed us through the day. Later we could walk the quiet deck again, this time in daylight. Later we could talk about my retirement. Later we could review whether my life insurance policies were up to date. Because after a scare like that, Glenn said, a family should be prepared. Every suggestion came wrapped in care. Every act of care had a hook. He offered to carry my wallet. He said he could hold my room key so I would not lose it. He suggested Sarah manage my medication schedule, even though I took only one blood pressure pill each morning and had managed it perfectly without assistance for years. Small things, harmless things, the sort of things a man dismisses because objecting makes him seem cranky, suspicious, old. That was the genius of Glenn's control. He made resistance look like ingratitude. Sarah played a different role. She hovered with guilt in her fingers and fear under her eyes, but fear of what, I could not yet determine. She brought tea to my cabin and sat too close while I drank it. She asked whether I was sleeping. She adjusted the blanket over my knees, although the room was warm. She told me Glenn blamed himself. She told me not to be hard on him. He loves you, Dad. He just panicked. Men panic differently. She smiled when she said it, but her smile quivered. I wanted to ask her directly if she knew what he had done. I wanted to take her by the shoulders and demand my daughter back from whatever room she had locked herself inside. Instead, I thanked her for the tea and watched her glance toward the balcony door, toward the phone on the table, toward my jacket hanging on the chair where my wallet sat in the inside pocket. That afternoon, while they believed I was sleeping, I opened my eyes and listened. Cruise ships are never quiet. They hum. They breathe through vents. They roll softly under you even when the sea looks calm. Footsteps pass. Doors click. Laughter rises from balconies and falls away. In the middle of all that, I heard Sarah and Glenn in the corridor outside my cabin, their voices low but sharpened by conflict. I could not catch every word, only pieces. Too soon, he remembers. Stop pushing. Running out of time. The phrase running out of time stayed in me like a swallowed hook. Time for what? Time before the ship docked. Time before a debt came due. Time before some legal or financial window closed. That night after dinner, I doubled back toward their cabin with an excuse about misplacing my reading glasses. And because Glenn had become too confident in his own choreography, their door was not fully closed. Sarah was speaking first. We cannot keep trying the same approach, Glenn. People are watching now. The ship filed a report. The doctor made notes. If anything else happens to him before Miami, someone will ask questions. Glenn answered in a harsh whisper. We do not have the luxury of waiting. You heard Marcus last week. If your father changes the succession plan or sells his stake, we are finished. Do you understand finished? Sarah said something I could not hear, and then louder, with a desperation that sounded practiced and real at the same time. We should have planned this better. Now he is suspicious. And if he figures out what we are really doing, he will cut us off before we can fix anything. Glenn said, "Your father has been cutting you off emotionally for years. I am the only one trying to secure your future. Do not lose your nerve now." There was silence, then Sarah's voice smaller. "He is still my father." Glenn laughed once, short and ugly. "He is an obstacle with a pension, a company, and a house. Stop dressing it up." I backed away before the hallway could betray me. My legs carried me to my cabin, but the rest of me remained at that door. An obstacle with a pension, a company, and a house. I had been called many things in my life. Difficult, stubborn, hard-headed, too generous, too controlling. I had never before been reduced so completely by a member of my family, or by the man my family had allowed inside. The pain did not arrive as a clean wound. It seeped. It moved through memory and contaminated it. Glenn at Christmas, praising the roast while asking about my investment properties. Sarah in my kitchen, hugging me from behind and saying she did not know what she would do without me. Glenn offering to help organize my office because I should not be burdened by paperwork. Sarah asking for the alarm code after Margaret died because she wanted to make sure I was safe. Every tender thing returned with a shadow attached. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed watching the line of darkness around the cabin curtains and let my mind perform the work it had avoided for months. There had been the insurance call 2 weeks before the cruise. "We show a request to increase your coverage amount," the representative had said. I had laughed at the absurdity and told her I had made no such request. Sarah had dismissed it later as a clerical error. There had been the afternoon I found her at my home office desk with my laptop open, her face too bright when she said she needed to print work documents. There had been Glenn's sudden interest in the structure of Morrison Construction, in who could sign project approvals if I became incapacitated, in whether Marcus had buyout rights. There had been small withdrawals from my account that I blamed on subscriptions or forgotten expenses, because I did not want to become the kind of old man who suspected his own child of theft. Denial is not blindness. Denial is seeing a shape in the dark and deciding to call it furniture, because the alternative means admitting someone is standing in your room. By morning, I was tired enough to look frail, which helped. While Sarah and Glenn went to breakfast, I went to the ship's business center and locked myself in one of the small glass cubicles where executives pretended the ocean could not interrupt them. My hands shook as I logged into my banking portal, not because I feared what I would find, because I already knew. The statements opened slowly over the satellite connection, line by line, and there they were. Withdrawals, 300, 600, 450, always small enough to disappear beneath the noise of my life, always from ATMs near Sarah's apartment, near Glenn's gym, near a grocery store I knew they used. Over 4 months, $23,000 had walked out of my account in little shoes. I stared at the total until the numbers blurred, then printed the pages. Next came my business email. The password worked, but the login history showed access from devices I did not own. I found sent messages I had never written, emails to clients hinting that I was considering stepping back, emails to a subcontractor introducing Glenn as someone who might be more involved soon. One particularly careful message to Marcus suggested I had been thinking about family continuity and wanted Glenn copied on certain financial updates. The tone was almost mine, but not quite. Too smooth, too eager to sound reflective. Whoever had written it knew my vocabulary, but not my restraint. I printed those too. Then I searched my personal email and found the deleted draft to an attorney. It requested information about updating my will due to recent health concerns, and stated that I wished to ensure Sarah and Glenn were fully protected. I had not written it. I had not had health concerns beyond ordinary age. I had not wished to protect Glenn from anything except, perhaps, the consequences of his own ambition. I printed the draft and sat back, while the printer's mechanical whine filled the little room. The old Gerald would have confronted them immediately. He would have marched across the ship, papers in hand, demanding explanations, because he believed truth revealed in daylight forced people toward decency. That old Gerald still twitched inside me. He wanted his daughter to cry and confess. He wanted Glenn to fold under the force of accusation. He wanted one painful conversation to repair the architecture of family. But the new Gerald, the one who had swallowed seawater in the dark while his son-in-law listened for silence, understood that confrontation without control is just another offering to people who have already decided what you are worth. So I changed every password. I activated two-factor authentication. I removed stored devices. I locked accounts. I requested fraud alerts. I sent digital copies of every document to Marcus and to Patricia Holbrook, my attorney, with a subject line that contained only one word: urgent. When I returned to the deck chairs, Sarah was pretending to read a magazine upside down. Glenn was pretending not to watch for me. I sat slowly, letting them see the stiffness in my limbs. Sarah rushed to adjust my cushion. Glenn offered to get me juice. I thanked them both. Then I opened a paperback and held it in front of me while I watched over the top edge. They whispered when they thought my eyes were down. Sarah's knee bounced. Glenn placed his hand on it, not affectionately but firmly, stopping the movement. She went still. Justin did not exist in this story. No child to soften the room. No grandchild to misunderstand cruelty before growing into it. It was only the three of us, which made the betrayal cleaner and more suffocating. There was no innocent center left to protect. At noon, Sarah announced that she had a spa appointment. She kissed my cheek, and I had to resist the urge to wipe the spot afterward. The kiss was not cold. That was the worst part. It was warm and familiar. The same pressure she had used since adolescence when she wanted forgiveness before asking for it. Have some guy time, she said brightly. Glenn and Dad need to talk sports, or whatever men talk about. Glenn laughed. I smiled. We went to the sports bar on deck 12, where screens showed baseball highlights above shelves of liquor, and the air smelled of fried food and beer. Glenn chose a corner table away from other passengers. I let him. He began gently. That is how he liked to begin. He asked whether I was sleeping. He wondered whether trauma could cause delayed memory issues. He told me his uncle had once fallen and seemed fine, then became confused days later. He mentioned doctors. He mentioned evaluation. He mentioned Sarah being worried. Each sentence was a loop of rope tossed lightly around my wrist. I let him talk until our drinks arrived. Then I said, my memory is fine. Crystal clear, actually. His hand tightened around his beer bottle. I watched his knuckles pale. That is good, he said. Really good. I just want to make sure you are not pushing yourself. I have been remembering lots of things, I continued, keeping my voice almost conversational. Conversations I overheard, documents I found, emails I did not write, withdrawals I did not make. Funny what nearly dying can do to a man's attention. The mask did not fall all at once. It cracked in sections. First the smile froze, then his eyes flattened, then the color left his face. He leaned closer, and for the first time since the railing, he stopped pretending entirely. You do not understand the pressure we are under. I felt a terrible calm settle over me. Pressure, that was the word he chose. Not guilt, not debt, not fear. Pressure, as if the murder of an old man were a structural response to load. Tell me about the pressure, Glenn. He swallowed. Sarah lost her job 6 months ago. She did not want you to know. She was embarrassed. I had business debts, temporary debts, things that were supposed to turn around. We borrowed against cards, took advances, moved money around. It got out of hand. Then you kept talking about selling part of the company, about simplifying your life. Sarah thought you were going to leave everything to charity because of Margaret. She panicked. I panicked. We made mistakes. You pushed me into the Atlantic Ocean. He flinched, but only a little. It was not supposed to be like that. What was it supposed to be like? He stared at me, and I saw hatred move through him, because I had forced him to name himself. Klein, he whispered. Quick, an accident. You had already had wines. The deck was windy. People fall. People your age fall. You were not supposed to survive. There are sentences that create silence around themselves. That one did. The bar kept going. Glasses clinked. A man at another table laughed too loudly at something on television. A waitress asked someone if they wanted more fries. But at our corner table, the world narrowed to Glenn's breathing and my pulse. And Sarah. His silence lasted too long. I asked again. Sarah. She knew we needed the money, he said finally. She knew the plan was to make it look accidental. She did not want details. She told herself that mattered. I stood. My legs were steadier than they had been since the rescue. Glenn looked up at me, suddenly smaller, not because he regretted what he had done, but because he understood he had confessed to a man he failed to kill. I leaned down enough that he could hear me, without the nearby tables hearing. You and my daughter mistook generosity for weakness. That was your first mistake. You mistook grief for stupidity. That was your second. Your third mistake was leaving me alive. I walked away before he could respond. Behind me his chair scraped, then stopped. He did not follow. Cowards rarely follow when witnesses are present. After the sports bar confession, the ship became a sealed city of waiting. There were still 2 nights before Miami, and every corridor felt narrower because I now knew exactly what walked inside it. Glenn avoided being alone with me for the rest of the afternoon, which was a confession of its own. He stayed near Sarah, near crowds, near staff, near any witness who would make him appear harmless. Sarah, however, kept circling me. She came to my cabin at 4 with soup I had not asked for, and a cup of tea I did not drink. She stood in the doorway too long after I invited her in, holding the tray like an offering in a temple she had already robbed. You look pale, she said. I said almost drowning will do that. She flinched, then set the tray on the small table and began rearranging items that did not need rearranging. Spoon to the right, napkin folded, cup turned so the handle faced me. Little domestic gestures, little daughter gestures, the kind that once would have convinced me nothing truly dark could survive in someone who remembered how I took my tea. She sat across from me, knees together, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. For a while neither of us spoke. The ship rolled gently. Somewhere above us a child laughed. Sarah looked toward the balcony curtain, then back at me. Dad, she said, Glenn told me you two had a strange conversation at lunch. Her voice tried for casual and failed. I lifted the tea but did not drink. Strange how? She swallowed. He said you were saying things that sounded confused, accusatory, like maybe you were putting pieces together wrong because of the trauma. I watched her face while she said trauma. She believed some of what she was saying because belief made her survivable to herself. That was another thing I had begun to understand. Sarah did not wake each morning thinking, I am a daughter planning my father's death. She woke thinking, we are cornered. Glenn is desperate. Dad will not understand. One terrible thing will solve many terrible things. Then afterward, when the terrible thing failed, she needed trauma to be the culprit because murder was too large a mirror. I asked her, what pieces do you think I am putting together wrong? Her eyes filled at once too fast. Dad, please. I do not want to fight. I almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because fight had become another useful word. She had helped turn me into a target, but if I named the rifle, I was fighting. I said, then do not fight. Tell me the truth. The silence that followed pressed into the room. She looked down at her hands. She opened her mouth once, closed it, then whispered, sometimes things become complicated. That was as far as she could go before Glenn's gravity pulled her back. Complicated. Your mother dying was complicated. Raising you while running a company was complicated. Payroll during the recession was complicated. Hands on my back were not complicated. She covered her mouth, and for 1 second I thought she might break open, but the door behind her clicked softly. Glenn stood there without knocking. His smile was mild. Everything okay in here? Sarah turned too quickly. Yes, Dad and I were just talking. Glenn stepped inside and let the door close behind him. He did not sit. He stood beside Sarah's chair with one hand resting on the back of it, the same way a man places his hand on a gate he owns. Gerald, he said, Dr. Martinez mentioned stress can create emotional volatility after an incident like yours. I think we all need to be careful not to say things that cannot be unsaid. His gaze did not leave mine. It was a threat dressed as advice. I set the tea down. Some things need saying whether or not they can be unsaid. Sarah whispered, please, Dad. Glenn's hand moved from the chair to her shoulder. Her body stiffened. That small flinch did not rescue her from guilt, but it deepened the tragedy. She was afraid of him and loyal to the plan anyway. That evening, Glenn arranged dinner at a specialty restaurant with low lighting and too many mirrors. I understood why the moment we arrived. Mirrors create confusion. They multiply angles and let people watch without turning their heads. He chose a booth where he could see the entrance, the servers, my hands, Sarah's face, and the reflection of the room behind me. He ordered an expensive bottle of red wine and poured my glass generously, then topped it off whenever the level dropped by half an inch. After the second time, I placed my palm over the rim. Enough, He laughed softly. One glass will not hurt you. You had a shock. It might help you sleep. Sarah said Glenn let him decide. It was the first clean resistance I had seen from her, and it was tiny. But Glenn turned his head so slowly that her face changed before he spoke. Of course, he said. Gerald decides everything. The words were smooth. The punishment was in the pause afterward. He spent the meal telling stories about my age. Not directly insulting. That would have been too obvious. He talked about a friend's father who had become forgetful and accidentally signed away money to a scammer. He mentioned an article about elderly entrepreneurs staying too long in leadership and damaging the companies they love. He praised my accomplishments in the past tense. You built something incredible, Gerald. Built, burst, finished. Sarah stared at her plate. I cut my fish slowly and answered with neutral sounds. Glenn wanted me angry. Anger in public would help him. A trembling old man raising his voice in a restaurant after a traumatic fall would fit his next story nicely. I gave him nothing. That made him more dangerous. Later, back in my cabin, I found the tea Sarah had brought earlier still cooling on the table. I poured it down the sink. It may have been perfectly harmless. It may have been a daughter's sad attempt at care. I will never know. That is what betrayal does. It takes ordinary objects and removes their innocence. Tea becomes evidence. A blanket becomes restraint. A balcony becomes a threat. The next morning, I kept a plastic chair wedged under my cabin door while I showered. On the last full day at sea, Sarah asked if we could talk alone on the promenade deck. Glenn had gone to the casino, she said. I did not believe the casino part, but I agreed because the deck was crowded and bright. We walked slowly beneath lifeboats the color of emergency. Sarah kept her sunglasses on though the sky was overcast. For 10 minutes she talked about childhood, the beach trips, the camping weekend ruined by rain, the time I let her paint my thumbnail purple because Margaret dared me not to be boring. She was trying to summon a father she understood how to use. I let her speak because the memories belonged to me too, and I refused to let her theft extend backward without resistance. Then she stopped beside a row of deck chairs and said, "If someone makes one terrible mistake, does that erase everything good before it?" I turned toward the water. "One mistake, Sarah." She looked at me then, and behind the sunglasses I saw tears. "Maybe more than one," she whispered. I wanted to ask her if she had thought of Margaret while Glenn's hands were on my back. I wanted to ask if she had imagined calling funeral homes while my body was still in the sea. Instead I said, some mistakes are not mistakes. Some are decisions repeated until they become a plan. She pressed her lips together. "Glenn said you would say something like that." There it was again. Glenn inside her mouth. Glenn predicting me to her. Glenn building a cage from interpretation. "And what do you say?" She removed the sunglasses. Her eyes were red. "I say I do not know how to get out of this." It was the closest she came on that ship to telling the truth. Then her phone buzzed. She looked down. Whatever she read changed her face. "I have to go," she said. I watched her walk away, and for the first time I understood that Sarah was not only betraying me, she was disappearing from herself in increments, and some part of her knew it and kept walking. Glenn returned to my orbit after lunch with forced cheer. He had won $200 at blackjack, he said, as if small luck could rewrite the ship's moral weather. He suggested a family photograph before dinner, one last memory from the trip. I nearly refused, then agreed because I wanted the photograph, not for nostalgia, for evidence of the performance. We stood on the grand staircase while a ship photographer arranged us. Sarah on my left, Glenn on my right. Glenn's hand hovered behind my back, not touching this time. The photographer told us to smile. Sarah's mouth obeyed. Glenn's teeth flashed. I looked straight into the lens and let my face remain calm. When the flash went off, I felt as if the camera had captured 3 ghosts, only one of whom knew he was already gone. The final day of the cruise was not dramatic on the surface. That is what made it unbearable. We attended a dismal comedy show because Sarah insisted laughter would help everyone relax. We ate dinner in the main dining room, where a waiter asked if we were celebrating anything and Glenn said family, with such smoothness that I nearly admired the craft. Sarah drank too much wine. She laughed at nothing. Once when Glenn touched her wrist under the table, she pulled away without thinking, then apologized with her eyes. I watched both of them perform normalcy, while the evidence sat folded inside my jacket, and copies waited in inboxes they could no longer access. They did not know the accounts were locked. They did not know Marcus had already replied to my urgent email with 4 words, "I am with you." They did not know Patricia had left 3 messages before I finally called her from the cabin bathroom, with the shower running to cover my voice. Patricia had not wasted time with comfort. She listened. She asked precise questions. Did anyone witness the push? Did the ship file an incident report? Did I still have the clothing? Had Glenn admitted anything? I told her yes to the last, though not recorded, and she cursed quietly under her breath in a way I had never heard from her in 28 years of legal work. "Gerald," she said, "this is attempted murder and elder financial abuse." I said I knew. She said we needed law enforcement. I said not yet. Not because I wanted to protect them, and not because I was afraid. Because law enforcement would create a public process, and a public process would give Sarah and Glenn attention. Documents, opportunities, delays, narratives. I did not want a trial first. I wanted distance first. I wanted the supply lines cut. I wanted to be gone before they understood the map had changed. By the time the ship slid into Miami at dawn, I had not slept. Sarah stood at the balcony door in their cabin, I later imagined, watching the port emerge while believing she still had time to talk, cry, explain, or pivot. Glenn would have been calculating whether my silence meant fear or preparation. They both underestimated the value of a man who had spent his life building things from the ground up. People who inherit comfort often think action begins when someone raises their voice. Builders know action begins quietly, with measurements, permits, calls, signatures, and the decision not to tell anyone where the wall is going until the foundation is already poured. At 7:30 that morning, while Sarah and Glenn waited near the luggage area, I was in a taxi headed to First National Bank. My clothes still smelled faintly of salt despite cleaning. My shoulder ached. My throat hurt. But my mind was clear in a way it had not been for years. Margaret Chen, my banker of 12 years, met me before regular hours because I had called her from the ship, and because she had known my voice long enough to understand when ordinary policy needed a locked office and discretion. She looked at the printed statements, the ATM withdrawals, the suspicious requests, and her professional calm tightened into something personal. "Gerald," she said softly, "I am so sorry." "Do not be sorry yet," I told her. "Help me close every door." We closed accounts. We opened new ones at institutions Sarah had never heard me mention. We cancelled debit cards and credit cards. We flagged attempted access. We removed authorized users from anything that had ever been made convenient for family. Margaret called supervisors, fraud departments, and card services with the precision of a woman who understood that banking is not just money. It is access. It is oxygen. By 9:15, the accounts Sarah had been draining were empty or locked. By 9:40, the cards Glenn relied on for gas, hotels, business dinners, and the appearance of solvency were dead rectangles of plastic and metal. By 10:05, Margaret placed a confirmation folder in front of me and said, "Whoever has been using your information will discover the changes quickly." "Good," I said. Patricia Holbrook's office smelled of old paper and lemon oil. She had my email printed, annotated, and clipped into 3 piles when I arrived. Fraud, estate, immediate safety. That was Patricia. She did not waste headings on emotion. She read the ship documents, the bank statements, the forged draft, the email records, and the notes I had written after Glenn's confession. She looked older when she finished. Not surprised, exactly. Attorneys who stay in practice long enough lose surprise as an affordable luxury. But she looked sad. "You understand," she said, "that once we start restructuring, there may be no clean way back." "There is no back." She nodded once. "Then we began. I rewrote my will. Not adjusted. Rewrote." Sarah's name disappeared from the inheritance section like a candle pinched out. Glenn had never been there, but his absence became intentional. My estate would pass to the Morrison Foundation for Adult Literacy, the quiet charity I had funded in Margaret's memory after she died because she had believed adult illiteracy was a wound people carried in silence. Patricia set up a trust to handle my living expenses through her firm. We changed mailing addresses. We arranged for a private sale of my house. That hurt more than the bank. The house held Margaret's laugh in the kitchen tile, Sarah's height marks inside the pantry door, the back porch I rebuilt after a hurricane, the bedroom where grief had taught me how large a mattress can feel when one person is missing. But houses can become crime scenes without police tape. Sarah had searched my office there. Glenn had sat at my table and planned my death. The place had been poisoned by intention. I signed the listing authorization with a hand that did not shake, then sat in Patricia's office bathroom for 6 minutes afterward, because the grief arrived late and without dignity. Morrison Construction was last. Marcus Webb met me in the conference room where we had argued over bids, celebrated contracts, and survived recessions. He looked at my face and did not ask for small talk. I told him enough. Not everything, because saying my daughter helped plan my death still felt like swallowing glass, but enough for him to understand why I slid the buyout papers across the table. Fair market value, full transfer of my ownership stake, 48-hour completion. He stared at the document, then at me. Gerald, that company is your life. No, I said after a long moment. It was my work. I confused the two. He signed, not happily, not greedily. He signed like a man accepting custody of something he respected. The money moved into accounts Patricia controlled. The company changed hands without ceremony. No farewell speech, no cake, no office gathering. I walked through the building once before leaving. I touched the doorframe of my old office. I looked at the framed photo of the first crew I hired, all of us younger and sunburned, and too stupid to know how hard the next 30 years would be. I took the photo from the wall and carried it with me. Everything else stayed. By 6 that evening, the life Sarah and Glenn believed they were circling had vanished. The bank accounts were gone. The credit cards were dead. The house was under contract. The business was sold. My phone number changed. My old device sat in a drawer in Patricia's office, powered off, a coffin for the man they thought they could still reach. I rented a small furnished apartment under arrangements that left no obvious trail, and that first night I ate takeout Chinese from a paper carton while sitting on a sofa that smelled faintly of detergent and someone else's life. It was not beautiful. It was not triumphant. It was quiet. Quiet after betrayal feels like anesthesia at first. You do not trust it. You keep waiting for the next demand, the next performance, the next emotional invoice. But the phone did not ring. No one knocked. No one needed money. No one called me selfish for breathing. The begging began 11 days later. Sarah found the new number somehow, maybe through a weak link at the phone company, maybe through someone who believed her when she cried. The first call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee in the apartment kitchen. I answered without speaking. "Dad," she said. Just one word, and the old reflex moved in me like a dog hearing its name. "Dad, please, if this is you, answer me. I can hear you breathing. Something terrible has happened. All our accounts are frozen, the cards are not working, and there is a sold sign on your house. I do not understand. We are scared." I said nothing. I watched steam rise from the coffee. I watched my hand around the mug. Her voice cracked. "I know we made mistakes. We were under pressure. Glenn is trying to fix things. We need time. We need help. We are family. You cannot just disappear. You cannot punish me like this. Punish. There it was. Not survive. Not protect yourself. Punish. Even in terror, she placed herself at the center of the injury. I ended the call. Over the next 3 days, she called 17 times. Glenn called too. His messages moved through stages more efficiently than Sarah's. Confusion, frustration, warning, threat, bargaining. In one message he said, "Gerald, whatever you think happened on that ship, you are remembering it wrong. Trauma creates false impressions." In another he said, "You have no right to destroy Sarah's life because you and I had a disagreement." A disagreement. That was what he called the black water. That was what he called his hands on my back. Later he said, "We know you are alive. We know you are hiding. People can be found. Do not make this uglier than it needs to be." Sarah tried memory. She left a message about the first bicycle I bought her. She reminded me of the night Margaret died, and how we held each other in the hallway because neither of us could stand going back into the room. She said, "Mom would be ashamed of you," and that one made me put the phone down on the table and walk outside until the shaking stopped. The cruelty of invoking the dead is that they cannot defend their own names. Margaret would have been many things. Heartbroken, angry, maybe more merciful than I was, but ashamed of me for refusing to be murdered for money. No, not even grief could make that lie fit. Then came the message about danger. Dad, Sarah whispered one afternoon, Glenn owes money to people who are not like banks. They do not send letters. They hurt people. If you abandon us, if you keep hiding, they might come after me too. Do you want that? Do you want your daughter hurt because you needed to make a point? I hired an investigator the same day, not because I believed her, but because a father never fully stops checking whether the child who burned the house is still inside it. The report arrived 48 hours later. Glenn owed credit card companies, payday lenders, and an online gambling platform. No syndicate, no men with pliers, no shadow creditors, just greed, stupidity, and interest rates. Sarah had dressed ordinary consequences in the costume of mortal danger, because she still believed fear was a key that could open me. The first 48 hours after they discovered the financial walls were up became a study in escalation. Patricia preserved every voicemail. I made notes with times and summaries, because part of me still operated like a contractor documenting site conditions before a dispute. Tuesday morning, Sarah cried. Tuesday afternoon, Glenn threatened. Tuesday evening, Sarah softened her voice and asked whether I remembered singing to her when she had chicken pox. Wednesday morning, Glenn accused me of elder abandonment, a phrase so absurd I had to write it down twice. Wednesday afternoon, Sarah said Glenn had not eaten. Wednesday night, Glenn said Sarah was becoming unstable, and if anything happened to her, it would be on my conscience. They passed guilt back and forth like a tool, each using the handle that fit their grip. Patricia wanted to file immediately for protective orders. I told her to prepare them, but wait. Waiting was not mercy. Waiting was strategy. Every call showed more. Every message revealed motive, language, coordination. Glenn could not stop himself from narrating his entitlement. Sarah could not stop herself from revealing the emotional architecture beneath it. In one call she said, "We only needed time, Dad. If the cruise had gone differently, everything would have been stable." She did not realize what she had said until silence answered her. Then she began to sob and said she meant if the accident had not happened. But the first version was the true one. If the cruise had gone differently, if I had died. Stability built on my absence. Their practical collapse was almost mundane. That made it uglier. No cinematic thunder, just declined cards, frozen logins, unpaid rent, overdraft notices, a car repossession company leaving a yellow slip on their windshield. Sarah called one night from a grocery store parking lot because her card had declined while buying milk. She said people in line had stared. She said the cashier had been rude. She said, "I have never been so humiliated." I looked around my small apartment, at the folding chair I had bought for $12 because the rented one hurt my back, and thought of the word humiliation. I thought of coughing seawater while Glenn pretended to weep. I said nothing into the phone until she hung up. Glenn's anger became less polished as his options narrowed. One voicemail began with him calm and ended with him shouting so hard the audio distorted. "You think money makes you God. You think because you closed accounts, you can close blood. Sarah is your blood. She is all you have. Without her, you are just an old man hiding in a rented room, waiting to die." That one found its mark because it contained a truth inside the poison. I was an old man in a rented room. I was hiding. I was waiting, though not to die. I was waiting for fear to finish burning through me so I could see what remained. The next day, I bought a plant for the apartment windowsill because the room needed proof that hiding and living were not the same thing. Sarah's remorse, when it began to appear, did not arrive as one clean transformation. It flickered. In one message, she accepted responsibility. In the next, she blamed Glenn, then herself, then me, then grief, then debt. Human beings retreat from self-knowledge like hands from flame. She said, "I stood there because I was scared of him." Then 2 minutes later, "I also wanted it to be over. Then I did not think you would really die. Then I knew you might. Then I hate that part of me." Listening to those messages was like watching someone dig through rubble and occasionally uncover a bone. It was real, but it was not enough to rebuild the house. The hospital call about Glenn changed nothing legally, but it changed the emotional temperature. I called Patricia before deciding whether to respond. She listened to the message and said, "Gerald, a suicide attempt can be both real suffering and manipulation. Those are not mutually exclusive." I knew that. I hated knowing it. Glenn had swallowed pills, but he had also lived by making other people responsible for his emergencies. If I rushed in, the old system would reassemble around his body. Sarah at the hospital, me paying bills, Glenn surviving into sympathy, the ocean receding into a complicated mistake. So I did not rush. I sent no money. I made no call. That restraint felt monstrous for 24 hours, then necessary, then cold. When Sarah finally apologized without asking for anything, I believed the apology because it had no visible invoice attached. But believing an apology is not the same as accepting a relationship. That distinction saved me. I wrote her a letter after the cemetery call and did not send it. In it, I told her about the water, not the event. The water, the way it entered my sleeves, filled my shoes, pressed my tongue against the roof of my mouth. I wrote that while she stood above me deciding whether to be daughter or beneficiary, my body was fighting for seconds. I wrote that I loved her, which was still true in the way a buried root may still hold moisture, but that love had become unsafe as a road washed out by flood. I wrote that if she ever became someone who could live honestly, I hoped she would build a life that did not require my forgiveness as foundation. Then I burned the letter in the kitchen sink, because sending it would have turned my pain into another object she could hold. The 18th call was the one that cut deepest. It came from a hospital. Glenn had taken pills, she said. He survived. She cried differently that time. Less polished, less useful. He said he could not live with what we did, Dad. He said he hears the water at night. I hear it too. I see you going over the railing. I see myself standing there. I keep asking what kind of daughter stands there. What kind of daughter waits to see if her father dies? Her voice broke into something that sounded like the girl I had lost long before the cruise. I do not know when I became this person. I do not know when needing money became bigger than loving you. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I listened to the whole message 3 times, not because it changed anything, because part of me needed proof that remorse could still exist somewhere in the wreckage. But remorse is not repair. Regret is not restitution. Tears do not refill lungs with air. A daughter understanding that she destroyed her family does not give the father back the family he believed in. The next morning I drove to Margaret's grave and told her everything. I spoke quietly because cemeteries make even pain lower its voice. I told her about the railing, the water, the forged emails, the accounts, the house sale, the calls, the hospital. I told her I did not know whether Sarah could ever become someone we would recognize again. I told her I could not save our daughter without handing myself back to the people who had already decided I was worth more dead than alive. The stone gave me no answer. The grass moved in a small wind. Somewhere nearby, a groundskeeper started a mower, and the ordinary noise of maintenance continued around the ruins of my life. When Sarah called as I was leaving the cemetery, I answered, "Hello, Sarah." The silence that followed was almost childlike. "Dad, I did not speak. Please do not hang up. I know I do not deserve 1 minute. I know I do not deserve your voice. I just need to say this while I can. I am sorry for the money. I am sorry for the lies. I am sorry for the cruise. I am sorry for standing there and letting Glenn put his hands on you. I tell myself I froze, but that is too kind. I chose not to stop him, because stopping him meant losing the answer we thought we needed. I hate myself for that. I hope I hate myself for it forever, because if I ever stop hating it, then there is nothing human left in me. I closed my eyes. Traffic moved beyond the cemetery wall. I do not expect forgiveness, she continued. I do not expect money. I do not expect to know where you are. I just wanted to tell you that I remember who you were before we turned you into a target. You worked 3 jobs when Mom got sick. You slept in hospital chairs. You paid my rent when I was too proud to ask. You never once made me feel like a burden. And I repaid that by making your life into a balance sheet. I destroyed our family, Dad. I know that now. But please, wherever you are, do not let what Glenn and I did turn you into nothing but pain. You deserve a life that does not include us. Maybe that is the only decent thing I can give you now." The call ended. I sat in the car for a long time with the phone in my lap. People imagine betrayal ends when the betrayer is punished, or when the victim escapes. It does not. Betrayal continues in every memory that must be reclassified. It continues in every kindness you now distrust, every familiar phrase that returns with teeth. Sarah had released me in her way, but release is not restoration. It is only the unlocking of a door after the room has burned. The anonymous safety I built after Miami did not arrive smoothly. The first apartment was too quiet in the wrong way. It had beige walls, rented furniture, and a refrigerator that clicked every 40 minutes like someone trying a lock. I kept waking at night convinced I heard Sarah in the hallway. Not the adult Sarah with the careful voice, but the child Sarah calling for water after a nightmare. I would sit up before I remembered that she was not there, that she had become the nightmare. And then shame would come because a father is not supposed to think that sentence about his child. I kept the curtains closed for the first week. I checked the peephole before opening the door, even when I had ordered food. I slept with a chair angled beneath the handle, like a man in a cheap motel, hiding from debt collectors. Once, a maintenance worker knocked to replace an air filter, and I nearly dropped a glass because the knock sounded too much like a fist on a cabin door. Survival made me ridiculous before it made me calm. Patricia urged me to speak with a therapist. I told her I was too old to tell a stranger. My daughter helped try to kill me. She said that was exactly why I should. I did not go. Not then. I believed paperwork could substitute for healing, because paperwork had always been where I restored order. Fraud affidavits, trust documents, sale confirmations, password resets. Every form signed felt like one board nailed across a broken window. But inside, wind kept coming through. I would make coffee and remember Sarah at 7, standing on a step stool beside Margaret, cracking eggs into a bowl with impossible seriousness. I would see Glenn's face at the railing. Then the two images would overlap, and my hand would grip the counter until my knuckles hurt. The mind does not file trauma neatly. It throws evidence on the floor and makes you walk through it barefoot. The private investigator's report on Glenn took 4 days to complete and 2 hours to read because I kept stopping. There were debts, yes, but also patterns. Failed partnerships, short-term ventures abandoned after seed money disappeared, complaints from former employers that never became lawsuits because the amounts were small enough to write off. Women who described him as charming until he needed something and frightening when he did not get it. One former business associate said Glenn liked to stand close during arguments, never touching, just close enough to make the body prepare for impact. Another said he kept records on people, little weaknesses, family illnesses, old mistakes, anything useful. Reading it, I understood that my family had not been uniquely targeted by a monster who wandered in from nowhere. Glenn had been practicing long before Sarah. She had been both victim and accomplice, and that complexity offered no comfort because the result was still my body in the ocean. The report on Sarah hurt differently. No criminal record, no history of fraud before the withdrawals from my account, but job loss concealed for 6 months, credit cards maxed out, a storage unit filled with furniture from an apartment she and Glenn had left behind after breaking a lease. Emails to friends that shifted from embarrassment to resentment to entitlement. In one message she wrote, "Dad has more than he will ever use, and he acts like asking for help is some moral failure." I stared at that line for a long time. I had never made asking for help a moral failure. I had paid tuition, medical bills, rent deposits, car repairs, and emergency dental work. What I had not done was hand over control of my life while I was alive. To Sarah, by then, that had become withholding. The day the house sale closed, I drove by once against Patricia's advice. I parked down the block and watched a young couple carry boxes up the front steps. The woman laughed because the man nearly dropped a lamp. They looked ordinary, hopeful, tired from moving. I expected jealousy, but what came first was relief. The house had been handed to people who did not know where the office safe had been, who did not know Sarah had cried on that porch after Margaret's funeral, who did not know Glenn had once stood in the kitchen and asked whether the property taxes were burdensome. Their ignorance claimed the place in a way I could not. Then the woman paused at the door and touched the frame, a small gesture of ownership, and grief hit so hard that I had to lower my head to the steering wheel. Margaret was in that house in 1,000 invisible ways, and I had sold all of them to strangers because my daughter made memory unsafe. I drove away before they saw me. When Marcus called after taking control of the company, I almost did not answer. I feared hearing the office noise behind him, the familiar rhythm of phones and printers and men calling across the hall about change orders. But he called 3 times, and Marcus had earned an answer. "Gerald," he said, "I found more." Glenn had contacted 2 vendors using old company templates. He was trying to establish credit lines in anticipation of a transition. "He used your scanned signature on one preliminary document, but it was sloppy. We caught it before anything shipped." I closed my eyes. Of course he had. Murder was not a separate act. It was part of an administrative plan. Death as a business process. Marcus asked whether I wanted him to pursue charges. I told him to preserve everything, report anything required by law, and otherwise protect the company. He said, "What about protecting you?" I looked around the apartment with its rented lamp and silent television, and said, "That is what I am doing." The calls from Sarah and Glenn formed their own weather system. Some days guilt rolled in heavy, other days threats cracked like summer heat. One message from Glenn came at 2:13 in the morning. He sounded drunk. "You think you are better than us because you built something. You built it for what? To sit alone with money." Sarah was right. You never really wanted a family. You wanted worship. I listened once and deleted it. At 4:02 he called again, crying this time, saying he was sick, saying the gambling had gotten out of control after Sarah lost her job, saying he loved her too much to watch her suffer. That was Glenn's pattern. When dominance failed, confession arrived wearing the costume of vulnerability. He did not want forgiveness. He wanted access restored. Sarah's messages were worse because they contained fragments of truth. "Dad, I found Mom's recipe box in storage. I do not know how it got there. I opened it and smelled the cards, and for a second I was 10 again. I do not know how I got from there to here." Another message. "Glenn says you made me weak. He says if you had taught me to stand on my own, I would not have needed you so much. I know that is not fair, but sometimes I believe him because believing him hurts less than believing I chose this." Another. "I keep dreaming that you are still in the water and I am on the deck trying to scream, but my mouth is full of coins." I would sit with those messages until the room seemed to tilt. Then I would remember her in the corridor saying they should have planned better, and pity would harden back into distance. One afternoon, I nearly called her back before the cemetery call. I had the number opened. My thumb hovered. I imagined saying, "Sarah, come alone, no Glenn. We will talk in a public place." Then I imagined the 1,000 doors such a meeting would open. Tears, explanations, requests disguised as closure. Glenn waiting outside. A private investigator following my car. A fatherly instinct turning into a leash. I put the phone down and went for a walk until dusk. That is what delayed resistance looks like from the inside. It is not heroic. It is a man standing in a grocery aisle unable to choose cereal because his daughter left a voicemail. It is a man rehearsing boundaries in an empty kitchen because if he hears her cry live, he might forget the ocean. When I finally drove to Margaret's grave, I took the long route past the old elementary school where Sarah had once played a tree in a first-grade performance and cried afterward because she wanted a speaking part. I had taken her for ice cream and told her trees were important because everyone else needed somewhere to stand. I remembered that line as I passed the school, and it broke me harder than anything else. Had I raised her to believe my role was to stand still while others used me? Had generosity taught her love or appetite? Those are the kinds of questions betrayed parents ask, not because the answers exist, but because blame needs somewhere to sleep. I arrived at the cemetery exhausted from accusing myself. At Margaret's grave, I spoke until my voice gave out. I told her I was angry with her too, which startled me as I said it. Angry that she had left me to handle this alone. Angry that she was preserved in memory while I had to become uglier to survive. Angry that Sarah could still use her name like a weapon, because Margaret was not here to take it back. Then I apologized to the stone because grief makes fools of the living. I placed my palm on the top of the marker and felt sun-warmed granite under my hand. I said I cannot be the father she remembers and the man who survives her at the same time. I have to choose. The wind moved through the cemetery trays. That was all, no blessing, no answer, just a living man making a choice beside the dead. 2 years later, the man named Gerald Morrison was officially dead. Patricia arranged it through legal channels I will not describe, because some kinds of disappearance require silence to remain merciful. The public record listed a boating accident off the coast of North Carolina. Body never recovered. The Morrison Foundation received the bulk of my estate, and expanded its literacy programs into 3 more counties. Marcus continued running Morrison Construction and sent no updates unless I asked, which I almost never did. Sarah filed for bankruptcy. Glenn was charged in connection with forged business documents after Marcus handed over evidence. Whether the suicide attempt had been despair, manipulation, or both, I never learned. I stopped asking questions whose answers would only tie a rope back to the life I had cut. I live now in a small cottage 6 blocks from the water on a quiet stretch of North Carolina coast, where fishermen mend nets beside docks that smell of salt, diesel, and old wood. The cottage has blue shutters, a kitchen table scarred by years of other people's breakfasts, and a porch that faces sunrise. The rent is less than I used to spend on a single dinner with Sarah and Glenn, and it buys me something no mansion ever gave me after Margaret died. Unwatched mornings, I wake before dawn, make coffee, and listen to gulls argue on the roof of the bait shop down the road. I work there 3 days a week for $12 an hour because Garrett, the owner, needed someone to mind the register while he went out on the water, and because honest work with no inheritance attached is cleaner than wealth surrounded by hunger. At Garrett's Bait and Tackle, no one cares that I once built a company from a truck and a toolbox. They care whether the shrimp is fresh, whether the tide is turning, whether I remembered to restock the hooks near the counter. Men come in with sun-damaged faces and hands like rope. Tourists come in smelling of sunscreen and optimism. Kids press their noses to the minnow tank. People say thank you and men only thank you. That simplicity saved me in ways therapy might not have. In the evenings, I tend a small garden behind the cottage. Tomatoes, peppers, basil, sunflowers taller than the fence. My hands, which once signed contracts large enough to change payrolls in 3 states, are often stained with dirt now. I like them better that way. The Atlantic is still there. That matters. I did not move inland because I refused to let Glenn own the ocean. At first, I could not stand the sound of night waves. They brought back the cold, the black water, the ship moving away. I would wake with my hands clawing at the sheets, coughing on air. Slowly, the ocean changed, not because it apologized. Nature does not apologize for being what it is. It changed because I met it on different terms. Morning walks, fishing lessons with Garrett, sunsets that turned the water gold enough to hurt. The same thing that nearly killed me became beautiful from a distance I chose. There is a lesson in that, though I do not polish it into wisdom for strangers. Once, about 18 months after I disappeared, a man in an expensive suit came into the bait shop asking for Gerald Morrison. He said a family was seeking reconciliation. He said there was a reward for information. He handed me a card. I looked at his clean shoes on the sand-dusted floor and told him I did not know anyone by that name. My voice did not shake. After he left, I tore the card into pieces so small that the trash swallowed them without shape. That night I called Patricia and told her to change everything again. Accounts, trust instructions, contact procedures. If anyone asks, I said, Gerald Morrison died at sea. Patricia was quiet. Then she said, Gerald, are you sure you want that to be the story? I looked through my kitchen window at the dark line of the ocean and said, that is not the story. That is the record. The story is that his family pushed him overboard and someone else climbed out. The move to the coast was not immediate peace. The cottage looked peaceful before it felt peaceful. The first night I slept there, the wind pushed through gaps in the old windows and made a thin whistling sound that reminded me of air vents on the ship. I woke before midnight with my heart racing and the taste of salt in my mouth, though I had not been near the water since sunset. I turned on every lamp. The cottage glowed like a small, frightened thing. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn with a screwdriver in front of me, not because I expected anyone, but because fear needs an object. In the morning, I walked to the hardware store and bought better locks. The clerk, a woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, asked if I was new in town. I said yes. She said, then get weather stripping too. These old cottages breathe like tired dogs. That was the first normal advice anyone had given me in months, and I almost thanked her too intensely. Garrett did not ask for my story when he offered me work. He only said, you know how to show up on time. That puts you ahead of half the people I have hired. The bait shop was cluttered, damp and honest. Tanks bubbled, freezers hummed, hooks hung in shining rows. Men came in before sunrise smelling of tobacco, coffee, and the particular hope fishermen carry even after decades of disappointment. I learned the register, the supplier schedule, The names of bait I had previously considered indistinguishable. Bloodworms, finger mullet, menhaden. The language was blunt and useful. No one asked about my estate plan. No one wanted my signature. A man would point to a shelf and say, "Those weights any good for rough surf?" And I would answer as best I could. If I did not know, I asked Garrett. Ignorance without shame became a luxury. Still, the past entered in small ways. A father came in one Saturday with his adult daughter, both laughing because she had never baited a hook and was making faces at the shrimp. He called her kiddo, though she was nearly 40. She rolled her eyes and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. I had to step into the back room and count boxes until I could breathe normally. Another day, a tourist wearing Glenn's cologne passed the counter, and my hand closed around the edge of the register so hard Garrett noticed. "You all right, Gerald?" I said yes. He did not believe me, but he let me keep the lie. That is another mercy of the coast. People allow silence room. Learning to fish took patience I did not possess at first. Garrett took me out on a gray morning when the water was flat and the horizon looked like dull metal. He showed me how to cast without forcing the rod, how to feel the line through my fingers, how to wait without turning waiting into resentment. "You cannot bully fish," he said. "You can only make an honest offer." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He was not. We stood on the pier for 2 hours and caught almost nothing. Near the end, I felt a tug so light I nearly missed it. Garrett said, "There, let it take. Do not yank like a man settling a lawsuit." I landed a small bluefish, bright and furious, and held it in my hands while it thrashed. Its body was pure life, terrified and shining. I released it back into the water, and watching it vanish did something strange to me. Not healing. I distrust that word now, but it loosened one knot. The garden came later. The previous tenant had left 2 tomato cages and a packet of basil seeds in a kitchen drawer. I planted them mostly because the soil behind the cottage looked lonely. The first shoots felt like evidence from a kinder trial. You put something small in the ground, you water it, you wait. It either lives or it does not. And if it lives, it does not ask why you needed it. By summer, the tomatoes were heavy enough to pull the vines sideways. I gave some to the woman at the hardware store. She brought me peaches in return. Garrett took basil and pretended it was for bait until his wife made pesto. Small exchanges, clean accounts, nothing hidden beneath them. When the private investigator came into the bait shop, I knew before he spoke. Expensive shoes do not belong on that floor unless someone is lost or looking. He scanned the room with distaste, then with professional discipline. His eyes paused on my face, moved away, returned. "Excuse me," he said. "I am looking for Gerald Morrison. A family matter." My hands continued sorting lures by size, though my pulse had turned loud in my ears. "Never heard of him." He stepped closer and lowered his voice into sympathy. "His daughter is trying to locate him. There were misunderstandings. She wants reconciliation." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw that he was not cruel. He was a tool rented by someone else's need. That almost made it worse. Tools do not know whose hand they extend. I told him to try the Chamber of Commerce. He left his card. The moment he stepped outside, Garrett emerged from the storage room where he had clearly heard everything. He looked at the card, then at me. "Trouble," I said. "Old trouble." Garrett nodded. "Old trouble is the kind that thinks it still has keys." He took the card from my hand, tore it once, then handed it back to me so I could finish the job. That night I did not sleep. The investigator had not found me by accident. Someone had spent money. Someone still believed I could be retrieved. That knowledge stripped the cottage of safety for a while. I walked through each room checking locks. I stood at the window watching the road. I imagined Sarah in some small apartment holding a lawyer's letter, telling herself reconciliation was not the same as pursuit. I imagined Glenn pushing her. I imagined both of them broke and older and still hungry. At 3 in the morning I called Patricia, and when she answered with the groggy fear of someone who knows late calls carry weight, I said, "Make Gerald Morrison harder to find than a body at sea." She did not argue. 2 weeks later, the record was complete. People think faking death, even legally through presumptions and structures and carefully arranged records, must feel theatrical. It did not. It felt administrative. Forms, filings, waiting periods, statements. The language was bloodless. Missing, presumed no recovery. Estate transfer. Foundation beneficiary. I read the documents at my kitchen table while rain tapped the windows. And the strangest part was seeing my own name written in the past tense. Gerald Morrison was. Gerald Morrison owned. Gerald Morrison is survived by. Survived by whom, I wondered. A daughter who helped destroy him. A son-in-law who failed to finish the act. A foundation with his wife's name attached. A man in a cottage who still answered to Gerald at the bait shop, but no longer belonged to the history attached to it. I signed where Patricia indicated. My signature looked familiar and foreign. After the death certificate arrived, I walked to the beach and stayed until dark. The tide was going out. Foam dragged back over sand in lace patterns. I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, I felt the cold weight of finality. There would be no accidental encounter years later in a grocery store. No hospital call where Sarah could claim blood as authority. No inheritance fight. No return to the house. No chance for her to stand in front of me old and ruined and ask whether I remembered the good years too. I had not just escaped her. I had buried the path between us. That was necessary. It was also brutal. Sometimes the necessary thing still leaves blood on your hands, even when the blood is only metaphorical and the knife is a pen. Now on most nights, peace is not joy. It is the absence of invasion. It is making soup and eating it while it is hot because no one interrupts with a crisis. It is leaving my wallet on the table without wondering who will photograph the cards inside. It is sleeping with the window open because the ocean air has become air again, not evidence. It is knowing that if I die in this cottage, my estate will teach adults to read instead of rewarding the people who measured my breath against their debts. That knowledge does not warm me. It steadies me. There is a difference, and at my age difference matters. There are still days when I become angry without warning. Not loud anger. I have not thrown anything. It is a precise internal heat that rises when someone mentions family cruises in the shop, or when a customer jokes about in-laws, or when a father buys a child a cheap fishing pole and the child complains it is not the expensive one. The hate says, tell them. Tell everyone what gratitude becomes when fed without boundaries. Tell the child to thank him. Tell the father to notice the complaint before it becomes a philosophy. But I do not. I ring up the purchase. I hand over change. I let strangers keep their innocent afternoon. I have also learned that peace can feel like betrayal of the self that suffered. The first time I laughed hard after moving to the cottage, truly laughed, it was because Garrett slipped on a wet dock and cursed so creatively that even the gulls seemed offended. I laughed until my side hurt, then went home and sat on the porch feeling guilty. How could I laugh when Sarah was bankrupt, when Glenn was ruined, when Margaret's grave held the only person who would have known how to name this grief? Then I realized guilt was just another chain leading backward. Suffering does not require lifelong worship. Pain is not dishonored by moments of relief. Still, I had to learn that slowly. A year after the cruise, I received a package through Patricia. No return address, but I knew Sarah's handwriting before I opened it. Inside was Margaret's recipe box, the wooden one with faded blue flowers on the lid. I had thought it lost in the house sale. Sarah must have taken it years earlier, maybe during one of her visits, maybe in grief, maybe in entitlement. There was a note folded inside. I should not have kept this. It belongs with you if you are alive, or with her foundation if you are not. I am sorry. I held the box for a long time. The cards inside still smelled faintly of cinnamon and paper. On the back of the meatloaf recipe Margaret had written, Gerald hates onions, but pretends he does not. I laughed, then cried so suddenly I had to sit on the floor. I kept the box. I did not respond. Some gifts are returns, not openings. That recipe box sits now on the kitchen shelf of the cottage. It is the only object from the old house I see every day. Not the company photo, not the deed, not awards or watches or framed articles. A box of stained cards written by a woman who never lived to see what loneliness did to the family she left behind. Sometimes I cook from it. Sometimes I read the notes in the margins and hear Margaret's voice, telling me I am using too much salt. The box does not heal anything. It anchors something that Sarah did not manage to corrupt completely. That matters. If Sarah ever truly changes, I may never know. That is part of the sentence we both serve. She must live without proof that remorse can earn access. I must live without proof that my daughter found her way back to decency. Clean endings are for people who have not loved someone dangerous. The rest of us learn to accept sealed doors. We learn to place flowers on graves, water gardens, sell bait, read novels, and sleep when sleep comes. We learn that being permanently changed is not the same as being permanently destroyed. I do not know where Sarah is now. I do not know whether she still thinks of me as alive somewhere, or whether the death certificate finally gave her a shape to grieve. Patricia once told me Sarah sent a message, not a request, not a demand, just words. She said she understood why I had to disappear and hoped I had found peace. I kept that message in my mind for a week, then let it settle where all impossible things settle. Not forgiven, not forgotten, not useless, just there. There is no clean justice in this story. Glenn did not get swallowed by the ocean he used as a weapon. Sarah did not transform into the little girl with sand on her knees and a seashell in her fist. I did not emerge purified, wise, and whole. I survived. Survival is colder than people think. It is not a sunrise with music behind it. It is waking up with the knowledge that the people you loved weighed your life against their debts and found you expendable. It is learning to drink coffee without waiting for the next betrayal. It is understanding that happiness, when it returns, does not erase the damage. It grows around it, cautious and strange, like grass through cracked concrete. Tonight the sun is lowering over the Atlantic, turning the water into sheets of copper and fire. The bait shop is closed. My garden needs watering. There is a mystery novel on my porch chair with a bookmark halfway through. Somewhere far away, Sarah and Glenn are living inside the consequences they built with their own hands. Somewhere in a file, Gerald Morrison is dead. Here, in this cottage that no one from my old life can find, I exist in a quieter tense. Not theirs, not reachable, not available for apology, rescue, inheritance, or blame. The 3 words I whispered to Glenn in the medical bay were "I know everything," and at the time I thought they were a warning. I understand now they were an obituary. They marked the death of the man who still believed love made people safe. The man who remains is not healed, but he is free, and freedom after betrayal is not warm. It is clean. It is silent. It is a locked door facing the sea.